Before my only daughter walked down the aisle, I went to a custom suit shop in downtown Dallas for a fitting. Out of nowhere, the owner, a man I trusted for decades, grabbed my arm, shoved me into a pitch-black fitting room, and whispered, "There are things you need to know. Stay here, do not say a word." Trust me, I was completely confused, but I stayed quiet. Minutes later, the voices I heard through the thin mahogany paneling left me entirely frozen in place, my blood turning to absolute ice. My name is Harrison Gallagher. I am 70 years old. I am a retired structural engineer who spent 40 years building commercial skyscrapers across Texas. I know how to spot a hairline crack in a foundation long before the entire building collapses. But God help me, I never saw the fatal crack in my own family until I was standing in the dark of that fitting room, listening to my future son-in-law calmly plot the murder of my only child. Tell me where you are listening from in the comments, and subscribe to hear how I tore this monster's life apart. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 4 days before the wedding. My daughter Maya was the center of my universe. Since my wife Martha passed away 7 years ago, Maya was all I had left. She was 32 years old, running her own art gallery and blindingly happy. She was engaged to Preston Cole. Preston was 35, flashy, drove a European sports car, and wore expensive designer clothes. He claimed to be a wealthy tech investor from the East Coast. He had a smooth way of talking that felt a little too practiced, but Maya looked at him like he hung the moon. As a father, you try to suppress your cynicism when you see your daughter glowing with pure happiness. I wanted to believe he was a good man. I was paying for the entire wedding at an exclusive country club because I wanted to give her the world. That Tuesday, I drove my truck down to Dominic Rossi's tailor shop. Dominic is a master tailor and a close friend I have known for 25 years. When I walked through the glass doors of his shop, the brass bell chimed, and Dominic looked up from a large bolt of dark silk. The color instantly drained from his face. He rushed over, flipped the sign on the door to closed, and locked the deadbolt. Before I could ask what on earth was going on, he grabbed me tightly by the shoulders and forcefully steered me toward the back of the shop. Dominic pushed me into the deepest VIP fitting room, the one with heavy velvet curtains and solid mahogany walls. He looked me dead in the eye, his hands physically shaking on my arms. He told me to stay in the dark, to not make a single sound, no matter what I heard. He closed the door and locked it from the outside. I was furious and totally disoriented. I almost banged my fists on the wood, thinking my old friend had finally lost his mind. But then I heard the front door of the shop unlock and open. The brass bell chimed again. Footsteps echoed loudly on the hardwood floor. 2 pairs of shoes. I recognized the voices immediately. It was Preston, my future son-in-law, and Valerie. Valerie was Preston's older sister and his supposed business partner. She had flown into town a week ago to help with the wedding preparations. They walked right past my fitting room and stopped in the adjacent lounge area separated from me by nothing but an inch of decorative wood paneling. I stood there in the pitch dark, holding my breath, waiting to hear what was so incredibly urgent that Dominic had to lock me away like a criminal. I thought maybe Preston was having financial trouble, or maybe there was some minor social scandal he wanted to hide from me. I was a practical man, fully prepared to solve a problem. I was absolutely not prepared for pure evil. Preston spoke first, his voice completely devoid of the charming, respectful tone he always used when speaking with me and Maya. He let out a low, arrogant laugh that made my stomach turn. He told Valerie they did not need to look at any fabric swatches today. He said the old man is completely clueless. He will sign the medical power of attorney at the rehearsal dinner, thinking it is just a standard trust fund set up to avoid taxes. I pressed my ear flat against the cold wood, my brow furrowing in the darkness. We had discussed a family trust to protect Maya's inheritance, but a medical power of attorney was never part of the original plan. Why would Preston need control over Maya's medical decisions? Valerie replied, her voice cold and sharp as a razor blade. She told Preston that was very good. She said as soon as the ink dries on that document, The $10 million life insurance policy becomes completely active. And then she said the words that literally stopped my heart from beating in my chest. She said, "Maya will not survive the hiking trip in the Swiss Alps. It is a tragic accident waiting to happen, and you will be the grieving widow holding all the cards." Preston chuckled again, a sickening, terrifying sound. He agreed, saying it was a brilliant plan. The air in my lungs turned to heavy ash. My legs felt like they were going to instantly give out beneath me. My mind raced back to the honeymoon plans. Preston had forcefully insisted on booking a remote, high-altitude hiking excursion in Switzerland, claiming it would be a romantic adventure. My beautiful Maya, who hated the cold and had zero mountain climbing experience, had reluctantly agreed just to make him happy. He was planning to push her off a mountain, and he needed me to blindly sign over my legal rights, so I could not intervene when she was brought into a foreign hospital on life support. They stayed in the shop for another 5 grueling minutes, calmly discussing the quickest way to liquidate my commercial real estate portfolio once they had complete control of my daughter's estate. Every single word they casually spoke was a heavy sledgehammer striking the foundation of my entire life. I did not move an inch. I did not breathe. I let the total darkness of that fitting room swallow my initial shock and carefully turn it into pure, unadulterated rage. I heard the shop door chime as they finally walked out into the daylight. Dominic immediately unlocked my door. He was sweating profusely, looking at me with absolute pity and terror. I did not say a word to him. I just reached out, gripped his shoulder in silent gratitude, and walked straight out the front door. I climbed into my heavy truck, gripping the leather steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned entirely white. I slammed my heavy boot on the gas pedal. I did not call the police. I did not have any recorded proof, only my word against theirs, and I knew Maya was completely under his manipulative spell. I sped straight through the Dallas traffic toward my daughter's apartment building. The rage burning in my chest was a living, breathing thing. I was going to kick her front door off its hinges. I was going to tear Preston apart piece by piece until he confessed everything. To any parent listening, never let the fear of pushing your children away stop you from trusting your ultimate gut feeling. Predators do not come with warning labels. They come disguised as everything your child has ever wanted. They use charm as a weapon and isolation as a daily tool. If someone enters your family and suddenly the dynamics turn completely toxic, if your child changes or starts pushing you away, do not politely step aside. Investigate. Ask the hard questions. Gather your evidence in the dark. It is always better to be a villain in their eyes for a single month than to mourn them for the rest of your life. If this story proved that a father's love is the ultimate shield, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of survival and absolute justice. Tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? See you in the next video. I parked my truck by the curb, ignoring the fire lane. My boots pounded against the concrete floor of the lobby as I ignored the concierge. I marched into the elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse. My chest was heaving. The doors slid open and I did not even bother to knock. I shoved the oak door so hard it slammed against the wall with a deafening crack. Maya gasped and dropped a stack of wedding invitations on the hardwood floor. Preston was sitting on the modern leather sofa, sipping a glass of sparkling water. He did not flinch. He did not jump. He just looked at me with those cold, empty eyes. They were the eyes of a predator calmly analyzing its prey. I crossed the living room in 3 massive strides. I pointed my finger directly at his face and told him I knew exactly what he was planning. I demanded to know about the medical power of attorney. I demanded to know about the $10 million life insurance policy and the sudden hiking trip in the Swiss Alps. I turned to Maya and begged her to get away from him, pleading that he and his supposed sister Valerie were planning to kill her. I was ready for him to break stutter or try to physically fight me right there in the living room. Instead, Preston did the most terrifying thing imaginable. He simply sighed, placed his glass on the coffee table, and looked at Maya with an expression of deep wounded sympathy. He slowly stood up, holding his hands open in a gesture of complete surrender. He spoke with a voice so smooth and perfectly calibrated, it made me sick. He calmly stated that he understood why I was confused, completely ignoring my raging anger. He walked over to his leather briefcase on the counter and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. He laid them out on the kitchen island, smoothing the crisp pages with his manicured hands. He turned to Maya, gently touching her arm to reassure her, and then he looked directly at me. He patiently explained that the trust fund paperwork was standard procedure for high-net-worth families entering a marriage. He said that with my commercial real estate portfolio in Dallas, Maya was facing a massive tax burden. He spoke about the 40% United States estate tax, throwing around complex financial jargon with the exact precision of a seasoned corporate attorney. He claimed the medical power of attorney was just a standard routine rider that the lawyers automatically attached to ensure Maya was protected if anything ever happened to me, not the other way around. He twisted the narrative so flawlessly that for a split second, even I questioned my own sanity. Then I brought up the $10 million life insurance policy. I yelled that it was a motive for premeditated murder. Preston still did not raise his voice. He reached into the briefcase again and pulled out a bank letter. He explained, looking at Maya with absolute devotion, that the life insurance was a mandatory requirement from the private bank to secure the mortgage on the new Beverly Hills mansion he was buying for their future together. He said it was a financial safety net to ensure Maya would never be burdened with crippling debt if he passed away unexpectedly. He made it sound incredibly romantic. He made it sound like the ultimate act of a providing husband. As for the Swiss Alps, he smiled softly and reminded Maya that it was supposed to be a surprise. He explained it was a highly supervised guided luxury tour with professional Sherpas, not some dangerous solo mountain climb. He played the victim with chilling perfection. He looked at me with sorrowful eyes and quietly asked why I hated him so deeply that I would invent a murder plot just days before the happiest moment of their lives. I turned to my daughter, desperately expecting her to see through on his smooth lies. I begged her to listen to me, trying to tell her about Dominic, the tailor shop, and they had just heard in the fitting room. But when I looked into Maya's eyes, I did not see the little girl I had raised and protected. I saw a complete stranger consumed by a carefully constructed illusion. Her face was flushed with intense anger. Her hands were trembling, but she was entirely furious with me. She stepped squarely in front of Preston, shielding him from my anger. She told me I had completely lost my mind. Her voice cracked as she brought up her mother. She said that ever since Martha died 7 years ago, I had become paranoid, suffocating, and controlling. She accused me of trying to ruin her happiness because I was terrified of being alone in my old age. Every single word she spoke was a dagger precisely aimed at my deepest emotional vulnerabilities. I tried to speak to explain the coldness in Valerie's voice, the sheer malice I had heard through that wooden wall. But Maya forcefully held up her hand, refusing to listen to another word. She said I had spent my entire life building cold, lifeless steel structures, and now I was trying to tear down the only beautiful thing she had ever built for herself. She cried bitterly, saying Preston had done nothing but support her and love her unconditionally, while I was acting like a crazy old man trying to sabotage her future. The betrayal in her eyes was devastating. She pointed a shaking finger toward the open doorway of the penthouse. She screamed that I was ruining her life and destroying her wedding. She told me to leave and not come back until I was ready to apologize and accept the man she loved. I stood there looking at the two of them. Preston wrapped his arms around her shoulders, kissing her head while she sobbed into his chest. Over her shaking shoulder, he looked right at me. A slow, chilling smirk crept across his face. It was the undeniable smirk of a man who knew he had won the first battle. I realized in that exact moment that fighting him in the open would only push Maya further into his deadly trap. If I kept pushing, she would cut me off completely, and she would die in those freezing mountains. I turned and slowly walked out of the apartment, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind me. I stood completely alone in the quiet, carpeted hallway. I was cut off from my only child. I had absolutely no evidence to take to the police. I had no allies left in her life. But I knew the absolute, terrifying truth. If Preston wanted to play a game of shadows to steal my legacy and harm my daughter, he was about to learn exactly how ruthless a loving father could be. Shoo. I walked toward the elevator, formulating a new plan. I was going to systematically dismantle his entire existence, piece by piece, until he had absolutely nothing left in this world to hide behind anymore. I spent a sleepless night staring at the ceiling, forcing my bruised ego to submit to cold logic. An engineer knows if you attack a fortified wall head-on, you only break your own tools. You must find the stress points. To do that, you need access. The next morning, I picked up my phone and did the hardest thing I have ever done. I called my daughter and lied. I let my voice shake. I forced a pathetic, trembling tone that made me sound incredibly old. I apologized profusely for my outburst. I blamed my behavior on the grief of losing her mother, claiming the thought of giving her away triggered a panic attack. I swallowed my pride and begged for her forgiveness. Maya hesitated, her voice laced with suspicion, but her heart is inherently good. She sighed, her tone softening, and invited me to join them for Sunday brunch at the country club to clear the air. She said Preston encouraged her to give me another chance. I thanked her, hung up the phone, and felt an icy resolve settle into my bones. Sunday morning arrived with a blinding sun. I walked onto the patio of the country club, wearing a tailored suit and a perfectly constructed mask of contrition. Maya, Preston, and Valerie were seated at a table overlooking the 18th hole. I approached them with an apologetic smile, playing the role of the chastened elder statesman who realized his place. Preston stood up to greet me, his expression radiating a smug, magnanimous victory. He played the gracious winner flawlessly, pulling out my chair and ordering me a coffee. Valerie sat across from him sipping a mimosa, her eyes tracking my movement with calculating precision. I sat down, unfolded my napkin, and completely shifted my mindset. I stopped talking and started observing. I shut off the emotional part of my brain, the part that screamed to grab Preston by the throat and engage the analytical mind of an engineer. I began to look for the hairline fractures in their facade. Preston dominated this conversation. He spoke at length about his wealthy upbringing in Boston, name-dropping elite boarding schools, and exclusive yacht clubs with practiced ease. He rested his left arm on the white tablecloth, prominently displaying a gold vintage Rolex. He caught me looking at it and proudly stated it was a family heirloom passed down from his grandfather, a titan of industry. It was a beautiful timepiece from a distance, but my eyes are trained to catch millimeter discrepancies in steel beams from 50 yards away. As he reached for his water glass, the sunlight caught the watch face perfectly. I watched the second hand. In a genuine vintage mechanical Rolex, the second hand sweeps in a continuous fluid motion. But Preston's watch did not sweep, it ticked, one rigid, distinct jump per second. It was a quartz movement. The watch was an incredibly cheap, mass-produced fake wrapped in a shiny gold casing. It was a counterfeit, just like the man wearing it. A small crack in the foundation had just revealed itself. My mind raced, filing the detail away as I casually nodded along to his fabricated family history. A few minutes later, the waiter brought our plates. In the process of adjusting my silverware, I deliberately knocked my cloth napkin off my lap. It fluttered to the stone floor. I leaned down to pick it up, glancing under the table for a fraction of a second. What I saw made my blood run cold. Valerie, the woman introduced to the world as his older sister, had her high-heeled shoe slipped off. Her bare foot was resting high on Preston's inner thigh, her toes slowly and intimately stroking his leg. It was a deeply familiar sexual gesture that no sister would ever perform. They were relaxed, entirely confident in their deception, believing the foolish old man across the table was blind to their game. I sat back up, keeping my face blank, my heart thumping a dangerous rhythm against my ribs. I turned my attention to Maya. Throughout the entire brunch, my vibrant, energetic daughter had barely spoken 3 sentences. She sat slumped in her chair, her posture completely defeated. Her normally radiant skin was pale and ashen, possessing a sickly, almost translucent quality. She stared at her untouched food with vacant, unfocused eyes. When the waiter asked if she wanted a refill, she blinked several times, seemingly struggling to process the simple question. Preston immediately intervened, placing a gentle, controlling hand over hers, smoothly answering for her. He claimed she was just exhausted from the wedding planning and needed rest. Maya simply nodded a slow, robotic movement and leaned her heavy head against his shoulder. The horrifying realization hit me like a freight train. She was not just tired. She was deeply lethargic, stripped of her natural agency. The conversation I heard in the fitting room echoed violently in my mind. They were systematically drugging her. They were keeping her in a compliant chemical haze to prevent her from noticing the red flags, ensuring she would blindly sign any document they put in front of her. Every protective instinct in my body screamed at me to stand up, flip the table, and drag my daughter out of that club right then and there. I wanted to scream for the police to demand a blood test to expose them to the entire dining room. But my engineering mind clamped down hard on my emotions, stopping me before I could make a fatal error. If I called the police right now, what would actually happen? I had no physical proof. I had a counterfeit watch and a fleeting glance under a table. Maya, under the heavy influence of whatever toxins they were feeding her, would undoubtedly defend Preston. The police would see a dramatic family dispute, a father making wild accusations against a loving fiancé. They would leave, and Preston would immediately realize the depth of my suspicion. He would accelerate his timeline. He would take Maya far away, completely sever my access, and execute his murderous plan where I could never reach them. I realized acting on impulse would sign my daughter's death warrant. I could not rely on gut feelings or circumstantial observations. I needed hard, irrefutable facts. I needed bank records, toxicological reports, and a documented trail of deception that no lawyer, police officer, or judge could ever ignore. I needed destructive evidence. I spent the remainder of the brunch playing my assigned role to perfection. I smiled, laughed at Preston's fake jokes, and kissed Maya's pale cheek when we parted ways in the parking lot. I watched Preston guide her into his sports car, a fake prince leading a captive princess into a meticulously designed trap. I waved goodbye, keeping the gentle, apologetic smile plastered on my face until their car disappeared around the bend of the driveway. The moment they were out of sight, the smile vanished. I walked back to my truck, my mind already calculating the complex geometry of their destruction. The game of shadows had begun, and I was Clear's throat to tear their world apart. The very next morning, I drove to the main branch of my bank in downtown Dallas. I wore a plain jacket and a baseball cap, keeping my head down as I bypassed the main teller lines. I went straight to the private wealth management offices and sat across from my personal banker. I told him I needed exactly $100,000 in untraceable cash. He looked at me with deep concern, gently asking if I was in trouble. I forced a tired smile and told him I was making a highly confidential investment in a private venture. He did not push the issue. An hour later, I walked out of that bank with a heavy leather duffel bag slung over my shoulder, the weight of the bundled bills pressing against my side. From the bank, I drove to a nondescript office building on the industrial edge of the city. I was not looking for a standard private detective who snaps photos of cheating spouses. I needed a ghost. I needed someone who operated entirely in the shadows, someone who understood the intricate mechanics of financial fraud. I made careful phone calls to old contacts in commercial construction men who dealt with corporate espionage, and every single one gave me the exact same name: Victor Thorne. Victor was a former federal financial investigator forced out of the agency a decade ago for his utterly ruthless methods. He did not care about legal red tape. He cared about results. I walked into his sparsely furnished office and dropped the heavy leather duffel bag directly onto his metal desk. I unzipped the top, revealing the stacks of $100 bills. Victor barely blinked. He leaned back in his creaking chair and asked me who we were destroying today. I told him everything. I detailed the conversation in the tailor shop, the fake watch, the suspicious legal documents, and the terrifying physical state of my daughter. Victor listened in absolute calculated silence. When I finished, he simply nodded, pulled a clean notepad from his drawer, and told me we were going to trace every single breath this man had ever taken. Before Victor and I could make a move, I needed to create a massive diversion. I needed Preston to feel completely victorious and entirely safe. I drove back to my house, packed a large golf bag, and deliberately called Maya while I was putting my clubs in the trunk. I made sure my voice sounded thoroughly defeated, playing the role of the broken father who had finally accepted defeat. I told her our terrible argument had shaken me to my core, and I was letting my grief over her mother ruin the most important week of her life. I said I was flying down to a secluded golf resort in Florida to cool off, clear my head, and prepare myself to walk her down the aisle with a genuine smile. Preston was in the background. I could hear him urging Maya to put me on speakerphone. He chimed in, his voice dripping with fake sugary concern. He told me it was a fantastic idea, assuring me that Florida would be exactly what I needed to relax. He promised he would take perfect care of Maya while I was gone, telling me to focus on my golf swing and let them handle the remaining wedding stress. I swallowed the bile rising in my throat. I thanked him, told Maya I loved her more than life itself, and ended the call. Preston thought he had successfully banished the annoying old man to a golf course 1,000 miles away. He was fatally mistaken. I did not fly to Florida. I drove to a private airfield on the outskirts of Dallas, where Victor had already chartered a small, untraceable jet using a corporate shell account. We boarded the plane in complete silence, bringing nothing but 2 small overnight bags and a pair of heavy laptops. As the jet climbed into the sky, banking sharply toward the East Coast, Victor laid out the wedding invitations Preston had so proudly designed. The heavy cream-colored cardstock featured a beautiful crest and an elegant return address for his family. Preston had relentlessly bragged about his generational wealth, claiming his family owned a massive historic estate in one of the most exclusive old-money neighborhoods in Boston. He spun elaborate tales during dinner parties about growing up in a sprawling stone mansion with manicured gardens and luxury cars. He said his parents were touring Europe and would fly directly into Dallas just in time for the rehearsal dinner. It was a perfectly constructed narrative designed to make my daughter feel like she was marrying royalty. But as Victor typed furiously on his laptop, tapping into restricted databases using backdoors, the federal government thought they had closed. Years ago, the cracks began to multiply. Victor pulled up property tax records, municipal utility bills, and zoning permits. The Boston address on the wedding invitations did not belong to the Cole family. There was absolutely no record of a wealthy Cole family existing anywhere in that prestigious zip code for the last 50 years. We landed in Boston under a heavy overcast sky. The air was bitterly cold, biting through my thin jacket, but I barely felt it. We rented a nondescript sedan and drove straight into the heart of the city. I navigated the narrow, winding streets, clutching the steering wheel, as the GPS guided us closer and closer to the address printed on the elegant wedding invitations. My heart pounded a relentless rhythm against my ribs. We turned off the main affluent boulevard and drove down a declining industrial side street. The grand, historic mansions with sprawling lawns quickly gave way to cracked sidewalks and tall chain-link fences. I pulled the sedan to a slow, creeping halt at the exact coordinates Preston had given the entire world. I put the car in park and stared out the windshield in absolute horrifying disbelief. There was no historic stone mansion. There were no manicured gardens or grand libraries. The address belonged to a dilapidated, abandoned strip mall, The windows were boarded up with rotting plywood covered in peeling graffiti and faded gang signs. The parking lot was a sea of cracked weed-choked asphalt, littered with broken glass and rusted shopping carts. The specific unit number listed as his family estate was nothing but a tiny ruined storefront that used to be a discount liquor shop, its faded awning sagging dangerously toward the very ground beneath it. Victor sat quietly in the passenger seat, his dark eyes locked on the completely desolate scene before us. He slowly closed his heavy laptop and turned to look directly at me. The silence in the small car was thick and heavy, suffocating me with the sheer terrifying magnitude of the entire deception. Preston was not a wealthy tech investor from an old money family. The man currently sleeping next to my heavily drugged daughter, the man systematically preparing to take full control of her entire life, did not actually exist. The upcoming wedding was a complete lie, and Preston was an absolute terrifying ghost. Victor did not waste a single second staring at the ruined building. He flipped his heavy laptop open again, the pale light of the screen casting long shadows across his focused face. His fingers flew across the keyboard with a practiced, terrifying speed. He bypassed the standard public directories and tapped directly into the municipal tax registries and property ownership archives. He linked the address of the abandoned discount liquor store to a network of obscure shell companies. The layers of deception were incredibly dense, meticulously designed to frustrate any standard background check. But Victor was not a standard investigator. He was a predator who hunted financial criminals for a living. I sat completely still in the driver's seat, silently listening to the rapid, rhythmic clicking of his keys, my eyes firmly locked on the rotting plywood covering the ruined storefront. The damp, freezing Boston air seeped through the windows, but a hot, suffocating anger was radiating from my chest. Victor broke the silence, his voice a low, steady hum. He explained that the shell company registered to this address was a dead end on paper. But every shell company has a registered agent, and a bank routing number seems to pay the minimum state filing fees. He ran that routing number through a specialized financial database, tracing the origin of the funds. The screen began to populate with a dizzying cascade of banking records, wire transfers, and offshore accounts. It was an intricate web of stolen money being funneled through dummy corporations. Victor pointed to a specific series of transactions. He showed me how the money was being systematically washed and redirected to a high-yield checking account in Dallas, Texas. That single account was the lifeblood of his fabricated existence. It paid for the European sports car. It paid for the tailored suits. It funded the extravagant dinners at five-star restaurants and the illusion of a wildly successful tech investor. Every single dime of his glamorous lifestyle was violently extracted from the accounts of unknown victims and funneled through this decaying strip mall. I stared at the glowing screen, watching the digital numbers representing millions of stolen dollars slide across the dark monitor. A sickening wave of disgust washed over me. I leaned my head against the cold glass of the car window and closed my eyes. My mind instantly drifted back to the sweltering, unforgiving heat of the Texas summers. I thought about the 40 years I spent building my commercial real estate portfolio. I did not inherit a single penny. I started as a junior structural engineer, wearing steel-toed boots and a hard hat walking construction sites when the concrete was still wet and the temperature pushed past 100 degrees. I voluntarily worked grueling 80-hour weeks, missing countless family dinners, school recitals, and weekend baseball games, simply because I was absolutely determined to build an unbreakable foundation for my wife and my daughter. I remembered the physical toll it took on my body, the permanent ache in my lower back, the calluses on my hands that never completely faded, the countless nights I spent awake at the kitchen table, agonizing over blueprints and supply chain budgets. I poured my literal sweat and blood into the soil of Dallas to create a legacy of security and respect. I built skyscrapers that reached toward the clouds, structures designed to withstand the brutal forces of nature. And I did it all so Maya would never have to know the crushing weight of poverty or the desperate fear of instability. And now, sitting in this freezing rental car, I was forced to look at the exact opposite of everything I stood for. He was a parasite. He was a hollow, empty shell of a man who produced absolutely nothing of value. He did not build. He did not create. He simply identified innocent people who had worked hard their entire lives, people who were exceptionally trusting and highly vulnerable, and he systematically drained their financial accounts completely dry. He was trying to hijack my 40 years of relentless sacrifice overnight. He wanted to take the empire I built for my daughter and use it to fund his pathetic criminal vanity. The sheer audacity of his parasitic existence made my blood boil with a lethal intensity. I opened my eyes, the sadness completely burning away, leaving nothing but a hardened, calculated resolve. I was not going to expose him. I was going to utterly dismantle him. Victor let out a sharp, sudden breath. The rapid clicking of his keyboard abruptly stopped. He leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes narrowing as he read a newly decrypted file. The ambient light from the screen illuminated a sudden shift in his expression. The usual detached professionalism of the ex-federal investigator was replaced by genuine, unadulterated shock. He slowly shook his head, muttering under his breath that this guy was incredibly sloppy for someone playing such a high-stakes game. I demanded to know what he had found. I leaned over the center console, my eyes scanning the complex blocks of text on his screen. Victor pulled up a digitized police record from a precinct in Nevada, dating back over a decade. He explained that by cross-referencing the origin accounts with old arrest warrants for wire fraud, he had finally managed to bypass the fake identity. Preston Cole did not exist. It was an alias created 4 years ago. His real name was Thomas Vance. He was actually a convicted con artist who had previously served 3 hard years in a medium-security state penitentiary for ruthlessly orchestrating a massive real estate scam that specifically targeted vulnerable elderly widows. He had a documented history of financial predation. My chest tightened. The man sleeping next to my daughter was a convicted felon. But Victor was not finished. His fingers began to move across the keyboard again, even faster this time. He opened a separate browser window and accessed a deeply restricted public records database. He typed the real name Thomas Vance alongside the name Valerie Cross, referencing their past residential addresses and known associates. A progress bar loaded on the screen, dragging out the agonizing tension in the small, silent car. Suddenly, a high-resolution scanned document appeared on the monitor. It was an official state record, complete with a raised seal and a series of distinct signatures. Victor downloaded the file and opened it to full screen. He stared at it for a long, heavy moment. He slowly closed his eyes, let out a deep, heavy sigh, and then he violently slammed his silver laptop shut. The sudden, sharp noise echoed like a gunshot in the confined space of the vehicle. He turned his head and looked me directly in the eyes. His voice was completely devoid of any emotion, cold and absolute. He told me to brace myself. He gently placed his right hand flat on the closed laptop and quietly whispered the exact words that would officially begin the total, irreversible destruction of my beloved daughter's carefully fabricated reality. "Harrison," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly pitch. "They are not brother and sister." I stared at Victor, the damp chill of the Boston evening vanishing, replaced by a freezing numbness in my chest. I asked him to repeat what he had just said. Victor did not repeat himself. Instead, he tapped the screen of his laptop, enlarging the scanned document until the text filled the monitor. I leaned across the center console, scanning the heavily watermarked paper. It was a marriage certificate issued in Clark County, Nevada. The date stamped at the top showed it had been filed exactly 8 years ago. My eyes tracked down to the signatures at the bottom. The first signature belonged to Thomas Vance, the convicted felon I knew as Preston Cole. The second signature belonged to Valerie Vance, the woman currently staying in my daughter's guest room, eating our food, and posing as his loving, supportive older sister. They were not siblings. They were legally bound husband and wife. The sheer depravity of their deception washed over me like a physical blow. My mind flashed back to the country club brunch, to the horrifying image of Valerie rubbing her bare foot against Preston's thigh under the white tablecloth, while my beautiful, drugged daughter sat across from them. Victor kept his voice low and steady, analyzing the situation with the detached precision of a seasoned investigator. He explained we were looking at a highly organized, deeply experienced grifter team. He pulled up a secondary file outlining a pattern of behavior that made my blood run cold. This was their modus operandi. They systematically hunted for wealthy, emotionally vulnerable women. They targeted women who were isolated, or grieving women who were desperate for love and validation. Preston would assume a meticulously crafted fake identity, playing the role of the perfect, charming suitor. He would sweep the victim off her feet with lavish attention and fabricated wealth. Meanwhile, Valerie would insert herself into the dynamic as the protective but welcoming sister, providing a false sense of family and stability to complete the intricate illusion. Once the trap was set, and the victim was fully isolated from her real family and friends, they would strike with absolutely zero mercy or hesitation. But this time, Victor noted, his eyes dark and serious, the stakes were infinitely higher. Maya was not just a wealthy mark with a healthy savings account. Maya was the sole heir to a commercial real estate empire I had spent 4 decades building from the dirt up. And more importantly, she was about to be tied to a newly minted $10 million life insurance policy. They were not just planning to steal her money, take my properties, and run. They were planning to steal my entire legacy and then execute my only child in the freezing mountains of Switzerland to cash out the ultimate price. I sat back against the stiff fabric of the passenger seat, struggling to pull oxygen into my burning lungs. I had spent my entire life calculating load-bearing walls, assessing stress points, and reinforcing foundations with solid steel. I knew how to protect structures from hurricanes and earthquakes, but nothing had prepared me for the structural collapse of my own family. The monsters were already inside the house. They were sleeping under my daughter's roof, slowly poisoning her mind and body with whatever toxic cocktail they were slipping into her daily routine. I closed my eyes, fighting back a sudden overwhelming surge of tears. I could not cry. I could not afford the luxury of grief or panic. Maya needed an engineer right now. She needed a father who could build a trap so devastating and airtight that these parasites would never see the light of day again. Victor broke into my thoughts, asking how we should proceed. He suggested we take this newly discovered marriage certificate straight to the local authorities, hoping they could arrest Preston on outstanding warrants or parole violations under his real name. I shook my head, my jaw set with absolute unshakable determination. I told Victor an arrest for an old wire fraud charge would only put Thomas Vance away for a few short months. Valerie would post his bail, and they would disappear into the wind, forever vanishing before I could secure Maya's safety. I needed them to face justice for attempted murder. I needed to expose their active conspiracy in a way that left zero room for legal maneuvering or lenient plea deals. I told Victor we were sticking to the original plan. We had to let them walk directly into the snare at the rehearsal dinner. As I finished speaking, the sudden vibration of my cell phone startled both of us. It buzzed loudly in the cup holder between our seats. I picked it up, my hands trembling slightly as I looked at the brightly illuminated screen. It was a text message from Maya. Seeing her name brought a painful lump to my throat. I quickly unlocked the phone and opened the message, expecting a brief update or maybe another defensive argument about our terrible fight. Instead, the words I read made the blood freeze in my veins all over again. Maya had written, "Preston says my vitamins are making me dizzy, so we are moving the Swiss Alps trip up by 2 days. We leave right after the reception. A piece of shame." I read the text a second time and then a third, my eyes burning into the glowing white letters. Preston was accelerating the timeline. He knew the heavy sedatives and beta blockers he was feeding her were taking a visible toll. He knew she was becoming dangerously weak, perhaps too weak to stand through a long wedding reception. Or maybe he had sensed my sudden shift in demeanor during the brunch and realized his window of absolute safety was rapidly closing. Whatever his reasoning, he had panicked. He was manipulating her into leaving the country immediately after the reception, completely bypassing the 2-day grace period we had originally planned around. He was removing her from American soil, away from my protection, away from American law enforcement, faster than I had anticipated. I handed the phone to Victor. He read the short message in silence, his jaw tightening. He looked at me, confirming the terrifying reality of our new situation. The window for our counterattack had just violently slammed shut by 48 hours. We lacked the time to prepare our evidence with the authorities. We were now operating on an incredibly dangerous, highly compressed schedule. The rehearsal dinner was no longer just the final piece of the trap. It was the absolute deadline. If I did not stop them there, if I failed to execute the plan perfectly, Maya would be on a private jet to Europe by midnight, and I would never see my daughter alive again. I took a deep, shuddering breath, the cold Boston air filling my lungs. I turned the key and the heavy engine roared. I shifted the heavy rental car into drive. I had less than 72 hours to save her life. The countdown echoed in my mind. There was absolutely no time to process the sickening reality of the marriage certificate or the depth of their deception. I looked at Victor in the cold rental car and told him we needed to be back in Texas before sundown. We abandoned the Boston Strip Mall and drove back to the private airfield. The flight to Dallas was agonizingly silent. I visualized the layout of the penthouse I paid for, calculating blind spots, preparing myself. I was no longer just an angry father attempting to protect his daughter. I was an engineer dismantling a hostile structure from the inside out. As soon as the wheels touched the tarmac in Texas, Victor opened his laptop and accessed the cellular tracking software he used to locate financial fugitives. Within minutes, he confirmed that Preston and Maya were across town at a bakery for a final cake tasting. Valerie was registered at a bridal boutique, picking up last-minute alterations. The penthouse was completely empty, but the window of opportunity was terrifyingly narrow. I left Victor parked 2 blocks away from the luxury high-rise and walked toward the building with my head down. I bypassed the main lobby, entirely utilizing the underground service entrance I remembered from the original construction blueprints. I slipped into the freight elevator and rode it up to the penthouse level, my pulse pounding a steady rhythmic drum against my ribs. When the heavy metal doors slid open, I stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway. I stood before the massive oak door of their apartment. Preston had bragged about installing a military-grade smart lock system. To a structural engineer who spent decades designing commercial security access points, it was simply a puzzle waiting to be solved. I knelt down and examined the digital keypad and the underlying mechanical tumbler. I pulled a small tension wrench and a bypass probe from my pocket. I inserted the probe into the tiny maintenance gap beneath the housing feeling for the magnetic catch. With a slow, deliberate twist of my wrist, I disrupted the current just long enough to disengage the deadbolt. The heavy door clicked open with a soft, yielding sigh. I stepped inside, closing the door silently behind me. The apartment smelled of expensive vanilla candles and impending doom. I did not waste a single second looking at the wedding gifts piled in the living room. I moved with silent, purposeful strides directly toward the master suite, seeking the room Preston had claimed as his private home office. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The space was meticulously organized, projecting the false image of a highly successful executive. I began my search systematically. I checked the drawers, the filing cabinets, and the false bottoms of the desk, finding nothing. Preston was a convicted con artist. He would never leave his most dangerous secrets sitting in a standard drawer. He needed a secure hidden anchor. I stepped back and evaluated the room through the eyes of a builder. I calculated the square footage comparing the interior dimensions of the office to the hallway outside. There was a discrepancy. The wall behind his mahogany desk was nearly 8 inches thicker than the architectural standard. I moved around the desk and ran my hands over the smooth drywall. I tapped my knuckles against the surface. About 3 feet from the floor, the sound shifted from a hollow echo to a dull, dense thud. I felt along the baseboard and found a nearly invisible seam. I pressed my fingers firmly against the edge of the panel, and a small section of the wall popped open on a hidden spring hinge. Behind the panel sat a heavy, fireproof steel safe. It was a mechanical combination dial, not a digital keypad. My breathing grew shallow as I knelt in front of it. Cracking a mechanical safe requires absolute silence and a deep understanding of friction mechanics. I pressed my ear directly against the cold steel door, closing my eyes to isolate my hearing. I grasped the dial and began to turn it with agonizing slowness. I listened for the microscopic metallic clicks of the internal tumblers falling into place. It was a game of tactile feedback, feeling the slight drag of the locking mechanism as it engaged the pins. The first number hit with a heavy click. I reversed the rotation, feeling the precise moment the second pin caught. I turned the dial one final time to the right. The third click echoed loudly in my own ears. I pulled the heavy handle downward, and the steel door swung open, revealing the dark interior. I reached inside the safe and pulled out a small black plastic tray. Resting in the center of the tray was a cheap, disposable burner phone, but the object sitting right next to the phone was what made my blood freeze solid. It was a standard amber prescription bottle, stripped of any pharmacy labeling. Instead, a piece of white masking tape was wrapped around the plastic. The label simply read Maya's Supplements. I unscrewed the child-proof cap with trembling fingers. Inside the bottle was a collection of heavy, unmarked blue capsules. These were not vitamins. These were the chemical chains binding my daughter to her executioner. I quickly tipped the bottle over, stealing exactly 2 of the blue pills and slipping them deep into my breast pocket for toxicological testing. I screwed the cap back on and placed the bottle exactly where I had found it. A sharp sound shattered the absolute silence of the apartment. The private elevator chimed through the penthouse. Panic flared hot in my chest. They were back early. I shoved the plastic tray back into the safe, slammed the heavy steel door shut, and kicked the hidden wall panel back into place. I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering violently against my sternum. I could hear the front door unlocking. I heard Preston's smooth voice echoing in the entryway. I lunged out of the office and sprinted silently down the short hallway, slipping into the emergency fire stairwell just a fraction of a second before Preston turned the corner into the living area. I pulled the heavy fire door shut behind me, leaving it cracked open less than half an inch. I stood perfectly still, pressing my back against the wall. I could hear Preston moving through the apartment. He walked directly into his office. I heard the unmistakable sound of the hidden wall panel popping open, followed by the rapid turning of the safe dial. A moment later, I heard the distinct electronic tone of a phone powering on. It was the burner phone. I pressed my ear closer to the crack in the door, straining to catch every single syllable. Preston spoke in a hushed, strictly business tone. I heard him confirm that the cake tasting was successful and that Maya was resting. Then he delivered the words that confirmed my absolute worst nightmare. He spoke with chilling, clinical detachment. He said the dosage is perfect. Her heart rate is dropping. It will look exactly like natural altitude sickness in the Alps. The heavy steel fire door felt like a block of ice against my spine. I held my breath, listening to the muffled sounds of his footsteps moving away. I waited until I heard the faint rustle of the living room rug, signaling he had walked back to the main area of the penthouse. I slipped out of the emergency stairwell, taking the maintenance elevator down to the basement parking garage. My mind was racing with terrifying clarity. I burst through the exit doors and walked rapidly toward the rental car, where Victor was waiting. I climbed into the passenger seat, pulled the stolen blue capsules from my pocket, and dropped them onto the center console. I told Victor exactly what I had heard through the crack in the door. I repeated Preston's chilling words about altitude sickness and the perfect dosage. Victor did not show a single ounce of surprise. He put the car in drive, his face a mask of hardened concentration, and told me we were going to a private laboratory he trusted on the north side of the city. We needed absolute confirmation before making our next move. The drive across the city felt like a waking nightmare. Every red light was an agonizing delay, a precious second stolen from my daughter's expiring timeline. We pulled up to a nondescript concrete building nestled in a quiet commercial park. The sign on the glass door read Advanced Analytical Solutions. Victor bypassed the reception desk entirely, leading me down a sterile, brightly lit corridor toward the rear testing facilities. He pushed open a swinging door and introduced me to Dr. Eris Thorne, an independent forensic toxicologist who owed Victor a professional favor. Eris was a quiet man with tired eyes and a clean white coat. He did not ask unnecessary questions about where the unmarked pills came from, or why a former investigator was bringing them through his back door. He simply took the capsules, placed them into a sterilized tray, and told us the mass spectrometry analysis would take exactly 3 hours. He pointed us to a small windowless waiting room down the hall. Those 3 hours were the longest of my life. I paced the small room, the rhythmic sound of my boots measuring out the agonizing passage of time. I thought about Maya, her pale skin, and her empty eyes. Finally, the heavy door clicked open. Dr. Thorne walked into the room holding a thick stack of printed analytical reports. His expression was grim, the look a doctor gives right before delivering a terminal diagnosis. He handed the top sheet to Victor, but looked directly at me. He stated that the blue capsules were not nutritional supplements, vitamins, or benign herbal remedies. They were a highly concentrated, lethal pharmaceutical cocktail. He explained the chemical breakdown with terrifying precision. The primary ingredient was a massive dose of a powerful prescription beta blocker designed to artificially suppress the human heart rate and lower blood pressure to dangerously low levels. The secondary compound was a heavy, fast-acting hypnotic sedative. Dr. Thorne set the paperwork on the table and explained the deadly synergy of the combination. If a healthy person took these pills at sea level, they would experience extreme fatigue, lethargy, and a severe drop in blood pressure. It would mimic deep viral exhaustion. But if that same person took this precise cocktail while rapidly ascending to a massive altitude like the peaks of the Swiss Alps, the physiological results would be catastrophic. The thin mountain air would force the heart to pump faster to survive. The beta blockers would forcefully prevent the heart from speeding up. The resulting cardiovascular conflict would cause a massive, instantaneous cardiac arrest. It was a flawlessly designed, untraceable method of execution. It would look exactly like a tragic natural medical failure caused by severe altitude sickness. The toxicologist's words hit me with the devastating force of a wrecking ball. The room began to spin. A primal rage exploded in my chest, shattering the cold analytical control I had maintained. It was premeditated murder. Preston and Valerie were actively managing my daughter's chemical decline, preparing her body for a lonely death on a freezing mountain, all to collect a $10 million payout and inherit my life's work. I let out a guttural scream, a sound foreign to my own ears. I grabbed the edge of the metal table, my knuckles turning bone white, and hurled it across the room. It smashed against the drywall with a deafening crash. I turned toward the exit, my vision swimming in a sea of red. I did not care about plans, evidence, or the authorities anymore. I was going to drive straight back to the penthouse, kick the oak door off its hinges, and tear Preston apart with my bare hands. I was going to choke the life out of him. I reached the door handle, muscles coiled with violent intent. Before I could turn the knob, Victor moved with terrifying speed. He slammed his body against the door, blocking my exit. I grabbed his shirt to throw him aside, but he did not flinch. He grabbed my shoulders and shoved me hard against the wall, pinning me in place with incredible strength. He stared into my furious eyes, His voice was a harsh bark, cutting through the noise of my panic. He told me to stop acting like a reckless fool. He stated that if I walked into that penthouse and killed Preston today, I would spend the rest of my life rotting in prison. Worse, Valerie would vanish into the shadows, claim the hidden assets, and evade justice entirely. Maya would be left alone, traumatized and vulnerable to the remaining members of their criminal network. Victor's grip tightened. He lowered his voice, his tone shifting to a cold, razor-sharp promise. He said we had to destroy them legally, systematically, and publicly. We had to trap them in a cage constructed of their own arrogance, exposing their monstrous deception in front of everyone they manipulated. Only then would Maya truly be safe. I released my grip on his shirt. The red rage receded, replaced by a dark ocean of calculated hatred. I nodded, breathing heavy, agreeing to his terms. I smoothed my jacket, forcing the engineer back to the surface. Victor stepped away, adjusting his collar, satisfied the crisis was averted. He opened his laptop. He told me that while the toxicologist ran the analysis, he ran a deep algorithmic background check on Thomas Vance's history. He targeted unresolved police reports, suspicious accidental deaths, and massive life insurance payouts connected to aliases used over the last 10 years. He said the marriage certificate in Boston was just the beginning. He uncovered a horrifying pattern of systemic fatal predation. Victor turned the laptop so the screen faced me directly. He pulled up a scanned newspaper clipping from a Florida publication dated exactly 2 years ago. The headline announced, "Clears throat. The sudden passing of a wealthy heiress during a private yachting trip." He slammed his hand flat on the table, pointing a finger directly at the grainy photograph of the grieving widower featured in the article. I leaned closer to the illuminated screen, the stark blue light reflecting off the glossy surface of Victor's monitor and casting long, haunting shadows across the cramped interior of our rental car. The headline practically screamed at me from the digital archive, the bold black letters burning a permanent image into my retinas. It read, "Wealthy heiress drowns on honeymoon in Miami. Husband survives tragic accident." I stared at the grainy black and white photograph positioned just below the text. The man in the picture was standing on a wooden dock, his face buried in his hands in a perfect theatrical display of overwhelming grief for the news cameras. He was younger, his hair styled slightly differently, but the sharp angles of his jawline and the cold, predatory set of his shoulders were entirely unmistakable. It was Preston, or rather, it was Thomas Vance perfecting his deadly craft 2 years before he ever laid eyes on my daughter. Victor began reading the details of the police report aloud, his voice flat, clinical, and completely devoid of any emotion. The victim was a 32-year-old woman who had recently inherited a massive trust fund from her late father. They had been married for less than a month. During a private yacht charter off the beautiful Florida coast, she supposedly slipped on a wet deck and fell overboard in rough, unpredictable waters late at night. By the time the Coast Guard arrived on the scene to execute a massive search and rescue operation, it was simply too late. The autopsy found heavy traces of powerful prescription sleep aids in her system, but her new husband smoothly explained to the investigators that she had been suffering from severe anxiety and crippling insomnia leading up to the wedding. The local authorities ultimately ruled it a tragic accidental drowning. Preston walked away a grieving widower, completely cleared of any criminal wrongdoing. He also walked away with a clean, undisputed life insurance payout of exactly $5 million wired directly into his private accounts. The sheer horror of his past washed over me, but the blinding red rage that had nearly consumed me just minutes ago in the laboratory was completely gone. In its place, a freezing, absolute clarity took hold of my mind. I was no longer dealing with a greedy con artist looking for a quick, unearned payday. I was dealing with a highly experienced, calculating, and methodical serial killer. He had done this before. He had gotten away with it perfectly, and he was actively refining his deadly process to ensure he would never be caught. Maya was simply his next target, a much larger financial payout, requiring a slightly more sophisticated execution in the freezing altitudes of the Swiss Alps, rather than the warm waters of Miami. But a serial killer, no matter how smooth, charming, or experienced he might appear on the surface, is fundamentally arrogant. Preston believed he was the absolute smartest man in the room. He believed he had already secured his ultimate victory. He looked at me and saw a grieving, obsolete old man he could easily sweep aside without a second thought. He did not realize he had just declared an open war on a master builder. An engineer does not panic when he suddenly discovers a fatal structural flaw in a massive building. He analyzes the complex schematics, calculates the exact mathematical loads required, and builds a permanent, unbreakable solution to completely neutralize the immediate threat. My daughter's life was the ultimate structure, and I was going to reinforce her fragile foundation with an iron cage of undeniable destructive evidence. I was going to construct a trap so meticulously detailed, so absolutely airtight from every conceivable angle, that Preston would never see the sun again. I told Victor to print every single page of the Florida police report and carefully package it with the toxicologist's lethal chemical analysis. I grabbed my phone and immediately called the personal number for Richard Lawson. Richard had been my trusted personal estate attorney for over 25 years. He was a brilliant, razor-sharp legal mind who had expertly helped me navigate the complex zoning laws and massive corporate acquisitions that successfully built my entire commercial real estate empire. I told him it was an absolute matter of life and death, and I demanded he meet me at his private office in downtown Dallas immediately. The long, agonizing flight back to Texas was a complete blur of cold, calculated strategy. I walked into Richard's beautiful mahogany-paneled office just as the morning sun was beginning to rise over the sprawling city skyline. I did not waste a single second of our time with useless pleasantries or trivial small talk. I dropped the thick, heavy manila folder Victor had prepared directly onto the center of his polished desk. But before Richard could even attempt to look at the criminal background checks or the horrifying, lethal chemical reports, I pulled a separate, perfectly crisp document from my inside suit jacket pocket. It was the terrifying medical power of Attorney Preston had practically shoved in my face during our intense emotional confrontation at the penthouse. I told Richard that Preston vehemently claimed this document was merely standard procedure to protect Maya's personal assets and ensure her medical care in case of a routine, unexpected emergency.